everyone, this is Myf, your life and performance coach, and welcome to the Actually You Can podcast. Actually You Can is more than just a fun phrase to say. It's a philosophy of limitless potential, a mindset, an attitude, a conviction. Most importantly, it's about to make you achieve what you might never have thought possible. On this show, we discuss strategies for growth for ambitious individuals looking to achieve big things and live a thriving, fulfilled life. Each week, you'll hear from inspiring guests who will share their journeys, challenges, and lessons learned. And I'll be sharing insights and actionable takeaways from my aligned results framework that will help you to align your goals, mindset, and strategies to reach your highest potential. Be sure to hit subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to so you can easily find this podcast again and stay updated with new episodes dropping every week. In today's episode, I have the pleasure of exploring the topic of leadership with the accomplished leadership consultant, Andy Neillie. More specifically, we deep dive into how to transition from being a manager to a leader. We discuss what sets a leader apart from a manager and why it is so challenging for people to make the transition from one to the other. Andy suggests that the key to becoming a high-performing leader lies in 4 essential areas: conviction, competence, character, and covenant. And we explore each of these in more details in the show. So if you're looking to improve your abilities as a leader, then this episode is for you. Let's get to it. Hi, Andy. Welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you on today.
Excited to be with you, Meave. Looking forward to a good conversation.
And we're going to be talking about your superpower, which is turning managers into leaders. I'm so excited about this conversation today. But before we jump in, I would love for you to share just a little bit about yourself. Who is Andy and what do you do?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure it's a superpower, but I've been passionate about figuring out what makes a good leader for a long time. And it really kind of came as a combination of having a bad boss or two early it wasn't even in my career. It was when I first entered the workforce as a very young man and just had a couple of bosses that I just knew, you know what, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. And part of the reason I believe I knew it was the way it wasn't supposed to be, my faith became very important to me early in my life. And I'm reading in the Gospels about this servant leadership man, Jesus, who sacrificed all for us to lead his people well. And then I get hired and I run into people that are self-centered rather than self-serving. And I think even many years ago now, it kind of ignited the fire in me of what makes a good leader a good leader. And so that's the journey I've been on for, at this point, more than a couple of decades now.
And so you mentioned the couple of terms there. You mentioned boss, leader, and I know another one that gets thrown around as manager. I'd love to hear,
Right.
what would you say is the differences between the two? Let's start with boss. What is a boss?
Well, I would say boss is simply a title. Anybody that's hired and has a position over other people would be the boss. I think we typically use the language manager and leader. And indeed, as you and I've talked about in preparation for our time together on this podcast, you know, part of my passion is turning managers into leaders. A manager, someone who's charged with getting tasks done, with leading a team of some type to accomplish a goal. And that's a noble endeavor. I'm not about death to managers, but I am about managers recognizing there's a difference if you're going to be a leader. They're not exclusive, but if managers are about getting the job done, leaders are about doing it in such a way that people want to do it again and again and again with you because of who you are.
And so you mentioned that it's not like you want to see death to managers or anything like that. And I'd love to hear from you. What place do managers have? In what way would we need a manager as opposed to a leader?
Yeah. Well, they're so hard to define, I think, because we banty around so much these terms, particularly the leadership term. In my mind, a manager is in charge of doing things. A leader is more about the being of things. And that, therefore, the best managers are working to becoming high-performing leaders as well, if you would.
I love how you phrase that. The managers are doing the doing and the leaders are being. I think if everyone
Yeah,
takes a moment to reflect on the difference between there, maybe you can see some of those qualities in yourself or previous managers or leaders that you've had as well.
right.
And
Yeah.
out of interest, why is it so hard for people to be good leaders?
Well, I think that's a huge question. I think about you and some of your athletic background, and I think, part of it is you've got a highly competitive um, bicycle athlete who has driven their whole life to put themselves on the top of the podium, and that's an admirable thing. And now when they're put in a position of leader and coach, they're asked to bring the best out in other people. And so it's a real ego check, I think, where you have to take a step back. In fact, the whole idea of it at times, sometimes the best coaches, the best managers who understand leadership, they may not have been the podium winning athlete themselves, but they know how to bring the best out in other people. And that's why that whole concept of servant leadership, it is no longer about me, it is about we. And I think a second real challenge that we face here in the States where I live, there in Australia where you live, over the last 10 years or so, there's just been this growth of what I call celebrity leadership, where if you can get enough followers, you're a leader. And I still chuckle. My daughter learned to surf on Bondi Beach, and I watch the Bondi Beach, YouTube channel at times. And, some of those lifeguards have become like icons, right? Where there are these handsome young men running out into the surf. Here in the States, we have so many celebrities. Leadership is not about getting social media followers. It's about setting your people up to succeed. And so I think particularly in the last, 10 or 12 years, there's just been a misunderstanding about what makes a real leader a real leader. Some of the best leaders are invisible.
Yeah, just hearing you say that out loud, the first thing that comes to mind is almost like we've started comparing social media influencers to leaders. And at the end of the
Yeah.
day,
Yeah.
the influencers might be leading us towards a specific outcome, but they're not true leaders. What would you say
Yeah.
to that?
Yeah. Well, and it is confusing because the currency of good leadership is influence, but not the way we meet it in the social media sense, where influencers are trying to get 10,000 followers on YouTube so that they could make a living for it. But really, a leader is influencing a group of people toward a worthwhile outcome. I think that would be a great definition of leadership. And that leadership sometimes is direct management. I'm your boss and you're being paid to execute. You're standing at this piece of equipment in a plant, creating products so that we can get it out the door, or I'm leading you in other ways. Other times it's indirect influence. It's you aspiring to follow that person because you believe in what they're telling you about the future and about the opportunity. So leadership is about influence, but not the way we've defined celebrity influencers in 2023 and 2024.
Yeah, and they're not influencing you to spend big at the Black Friday sales, for example, like we were just
That's
talking about.
exactly right. That's exactly right. We're recording this a couple of weeks before it's going to be broadcast, and you and I have been talking about the U.S. sales syndrome here in around the Thanksgiving holiday. That's right.
It's all getting a bit out of hand, to be honest. But so I really liked how you shared that, especially reflecting on my own journey in sport and athletics. I joke about this with my husband quite a fair bit. I'm like, I'm an individual athlete. I've grown up being used to caring about self and getting results for
Yeah.
self. I joke that I hate group projects. Like, just give me the task, I'll do it myself. I do not
Yeah.
I have used it as a crutch saying I don't perform well in group projects. And I know that
Yeah.
that's a very sort of narrow minded, selfish view of the world. And so I've been on my own leadership journey and it's been super eye opening, definitely been challenging at times, but it's been so much more rewarding realizing how far you can get and how much more you can bring out in others when you work together as a team. And so I'd love,
Yeah.
and I know that the people listening to this podcast, they're ambitious individuals. And typically, when we
Yeah.
think about ambitious and achieving really great feats, we think we just need to do it ourselves. And so I'd love to hear, what would you say to someone who is identifying with some of those, I guess, selfish, for lack of a better term, tendencies, the
Yeah.
managerial traits? What would you say to them about their capacity to start being a
Yeah.
leader?
Well, I think I'd probably say a couple of things. First of all, being a high achieving individual performer is not a wrong thing. Here in the States, I work a lot with sales teams. And the truth of the matter is, there are some salespeople who are not good as sales managers. The highest and best use of them is as a frontline salesperson. And so let's just acknowledge there's not a career path for them to move into management. Their career path is to move perhaps into bigger and bigger deals where the stakes are higher and their great strengths can come to play. So it's not that individual performers don't have a place, but the old African proverb that you and I both know, if you want to go fast, go on your own. If you want to go far, go together. There comes a day when, and even I mean, in your world, there comes a day when there are going to be other bicycle people that are faster than you. They're younger than you. They're leaner than you. They're stronger than you. You and I talked. I do competitive CrossFit, and there's always somebody that's coming up that's more of an RX athlete than I will ever be. And that's okay, because what you can do is you can leverage the power of teams to accomplish more. And there are some things that set leaders apart. And part of that is a leader now begins to recognize my ego, in a good way, is tied to the success of my team. Good leaders, they sit at the bottom of the pyramid, not at the top of the pyramid. They are supporting everybody else. That's why I think that the challenge for managers who've been top performers is it's a challenge of ego. It's recognizing that I've got to not be targeting the top of the podium, but my goal is still to get us to the top of the podium, and the way I do that is supporting everybody on my team.
Yeah, and I really appreciate how you said that some people just they might not want to be managers or they don't have
Yeah,
their strength and their gifts to this world isn't to be people managers, and that's fine. We need
right, right.
doers. We need people who just get shit
Yeah,
done. And so
yeah,
and I think the thing with leadership is not like we're born out of the womb understanding how to lead, right? And then we're put into these positions whether we climb the corporate ladder or go, "Hey, you're now responsible for a team," where suddenly we need to practice leadership. How do you go about starting to develop the qualities of a leader? So, firstly, probably should ask, what do you think are the qualities of a good
yeah.
leader?
Yeah, well, that's a huge question. I chuckle about it because everybody talks about leadership here in the States. The professional trade group that I belong to estimates there are probably 17,000 leadership consultants like me. We're all over the place. There's nothing new under the sun. And indeed, if you go back 2,000 years, I think by the time you get done with Jesus Christ and Marcus Aurelius, there's probably not a whole lot new to say about leadership. Um, and so I've been thinking for many years, how do we just distill this down? Because there's just everybody's talking about it. I've been looking at folks like you and others for decades at this point. My dissertation studies were on the effectiveness of personal leadership. I've interviewed scores of leaders, read 25,000 pages for my dissertation. I think I've got a simple understanding, not simple to execute, but simple in its taxonomy, if you would. Excellent leaders are growing in conviction, their vision, their passion, their strategy. Excellent leaders are growing in their competence, the ability to get their teams to execute during times of risk. Excellent leaders are growing in their character themselves. You'll never be a better leader than you are a person. And then excellent leaders are growing in the covenant they have with the teams they lead. That's the one that I struggled with for a long time. Covenant is kind of an old-fashioned word. Here in the States, we probably need to bring it back to the forefront. Covenant is a reflection of both a formal and a personal relationship. So for instance, here in the state of Texas, where I live, if someone's going to get married, obviously there's love and affection forever, ever, and in better and worse, and sickness and in health, and all kinds of warmth and romantic love and affection. If it's a formal marriage here in the state of Texas, there's also an officiant who signs a formal document that's recorded with the Secretary of State. There's both the personal side and the relational side. And the best leaders I've worked with over the years, they drive hard. There's a performance expectation. We've got numbers we need to meet. We've got strategies we need to execute on. And then you also find out almost invisibly that leader gave that individual an extra 3 weeks of PTO because her mom was struggling with terminal cancer, and it didn't go down in HR. It wasn't a recorded thing. It just was the right thing to do. And somehow that manager demonstrated leadership by balancing the tension of we've got to drive for formal excellence while we meet the needs of the people that we serve.
Mm.
I talked at you a long time there. You can tell I'm kind of passionate about it, but those 4 C's, the 4 leadership necessities, conviction, competence, character, and covenant. I really do think that that begins to capture what makes a manager start to become a high performing leader.
There is a lot there, and I'd love to dig into each of those 4 Cs in more
Yeah.
detail. This
Yeah.
this fascinates me. So, conviction, tell me more about that.
Well, when you're an individual performer, what you're thinking about is what you have in front of you. And you might be thinking about the day's tasks. Maybe you're thinking about the workouts this week. Maybe you're thinking about what you've got in front of you. If you're going to become a leader, you've got to get your eyes up and you're seeing the bigger strategy. You're seeing a week, but you're also seeing a month and a quarter and a year out. Perhaps you need to think bigger. You also need to think broader if you're going to become a leader. All of a sudden, I've got to be aware of the competitive environment that my company is playing in and the economic headwinds that we're heading into here in 2024 and the challenge of China and the coming economic contraction. You've got to be thinking bigger. You also have to be thinking broader. And then, as I alluded to a minute ago, you need to be thinking further. You need to be thinking 3 years out, not just 3 weeks out. And so if you're going to be a manager who's trying to become a high performing leader, you got to get your eyes up, that high aim vision of seeing further down the road. That's the conviction piece.
And what's your thoughts? I mean, if you've been promoted up the ladder, for lack of a better term, what is your opinion on a leader's need to understand the technicalities of what their team's doing? So, for example, if I've come up the
Yeah.
ranks as a salesperson, now I'm leading a sales team, I have a acute awareness of the day to day life of a salesperson. But I know there's some
Yeah. Yeah.
incredible leaders who have no freaking idea of what a salesperson does, but they can still lead a team. What's your view there?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, some of the best leaders don't know the technical aspects, and I don't think they need to. You and I could laugh about your work with Trek. I suspect you have no idea why they decided to change that gear set, and now it's got 22 teeth instead of 20 teeth on it. And you're not supposed to know that. Your job is to get the team to get down the road faster. And so, you and I talked about sports before we turned the microphone on. Here in American football, some of the best American professional football coaches never played the sport at the highest level, but they coach at the highest level. So, yeah, I fully agree with you. I don't think you have to be great at what your people need to be great at. What you need to be great at is leading that team well.
Yeah, so if someone's sitting here going, "Oh, I can't lead these people because I don't know enough about the day to day or the product," then I'm calling bullshit on that. That's just a limiting belief.
Yeah, that's exactly right. My wife and I own several franchise businesses here in Central Texas, and if you put me behind the counter at one of those businesses, I would mess things up. That's not my job. My job is the vision. My job is to say where are we going to be in 3 years and why is this important and things like that.
And so how do you stay connected to, I guess, the frontline teams then? Obviously, there needs to be a relationship there, whether it's a mutual understanding
Yeah.
of or respect for what they do. How do you foster that relationship?
Well, and I think that takes us to that covenant piece that we talked
Yeah.
about. It requires time, right? You and I could talk with other people about what does it take to build trust? And I think the simple definition, the way you build trust is through time and making deposits, if you would, into their accounts and showing up and being there. I made a 3 hour round trip drive earlier this week to spend 30 minutes on site at one of our locations because I just needed to be there for some FaceTime. Did that single trip make a difference?
Mm.
No, but I believe 30 of those trips over an annual basis begins to make a difference. So I think it takes time. And then I also think it takes honesty and vulnerability.
Mm.
We are no longer at the top of the podium and we've gotta build our other people up and be transparent ourselves and move toward vulnerability and let them know that it's okay to be human first.
And I loved how you touched on the word vulnerability because I think that's something that many leaders sort of stumble over. It's like, no, I need to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
strong and I need to show a strong face. I can't show my emotions. My team need this from me. But there's also the need to show vulnerability because that's how you build the connection and the rapport. So
Yeah.
how what's your experience with that?
Yeah. Well, and I always have to be careful because I assume the same as in the true in Australia is here in the States. LinkedIn has just blown up in the
Yeah.
last couple of years with the vulnerable business leader who's crying on LinkedIn, who's apologizing. Mifa, I think there's a journey that we have to go down with our people. And I really talk about the transparency to vulnerability continuum. You and I are going to have this energizing, for me at least, 30-minute discussion about leadership and turning managers into leaders. And during the time, you're going to admit a few things, and I'm going to admit a few things. We're being a little bit transparent with each other and with your followers, but we're not really being vulnerable. Vulnerable is when I say, I stink at this. In fact, I need you to help me get better. And I'm going to expose my weakness. That's a journey that should move down slowly. That's why I said trust takes time. I don't think it's appropriate for a leader to show up and throw up on their team members. It's a journey together where you begin to recognize it's okay to be a little less guarded and a little less guarded. This is a safe environment. And I do think leaders need to take the first step because they've got to model the way. But we don't need any more crying CEOs putting their tears up on LinkedIn.
And I loved how you started by going, the relationship starts with transparency. And if I reflect on all of the good leaders that I've had, it's yes, they've been transparent about what's been going on, and that's helped build the trust. Like I feel like part of the team, I feel like they trust
Right.
me. I feel like I'm yeah, I'm part of the day to day. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, starting with transparency, and that leads to, over time, to what you're saying, to vulnerability, where you might share some
Yeah.
more detailed information. Like I'm not going to share my whole family history to a leader that I've just met, but if they start being transparent
Right.
with me, I might start to build that relationship where I feel more comfortable maybe sharing those sorts of
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, no, those of us that are watching this, I just saw a dog jump down off the daybed. As I told you, I'm broadcasting from our little home den today because it's a holiday weekend in the States. We just rescued a dog about 6 weeks ago. We're big dog rescuers. We've rescued a dozen of them. I've written a couple of books, one bestseller here in the States about the life of our golden retrievers and what they've taught us. Traveler didn't trust me at first. I'm big. I've got a loud voice. I move quickly. I had to start slowly. Today, Trevor will romp with me out in the yard, and he's not afraid of me when I get down and want to wrestle with him. But it took time. It took time. And I think that's one of the things you don't get to walk in and say, I'm in charge now. No, it's a time builds trust thing.
And is there anything else you wanted to add on covenants? We talked about the transparency,
Yeah.
vulnerability, trust. Is there anything else you wanted to add there?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, I struggled with this one. The other three, conviction and character and competence, I recognized relatively quickly. It took me a while. In fact, if you go back and look at some of my earlier work, I called it consistency, communication, constancy. I knew folks like you that were good at leading teams were in their people. Now, they weren't in their people so much that people didn't know they were still in charge. They were still in charge, but they lived with their people. They practiced with their people. Even in the remote world that we definitely live in right now, leaders need to show up in charge. In fact, one of my mandates for a manager who wants to be a leader is your camera is always on. If you're doing a Teams call or a Zoom call or a StreamYard, even if they're not on, your camera's on because you're modeling the way. So the leader leads first, and the leader Mifa, I will tell you, I don't think the wrestle ever goes away. When do you say, no, we have to stick by our standards,
Mm.
or yes, we're going to give that performer grace for what they missed? If a leader's not wrestling with that dynamic tension, I don't think they really understand covenant. Covenant is a risky relationship a leader has with their team members because you're never sure you get it right. It's it's a challenge. And that's why I would say managers who aspire to be high performing leaders are working on this. I don't ever think we get it perfect.
Yeah, and it's really challenging. I'm not sure if you have a similar sort of situation in the States, but at least in Australia, we have, and where I'm based in Canberra, we have a large portion of the workforce who we call public servants. So they're employed by the government. And the government does a really good job of looking after people in those roles, which makes it quite challenging to do things like performance managing or to lead. So if you have an
Yeah.
underperforming
Yeah.
team member, it's really, really hard as opposed to being in private organizations where you could have, I guess, a few more direct conversations or practice that
Yeah.
covenants a bit more and get some better outcomes. And
Yeah.
so, what would your advice or words of wisdom be for someone who's maybe in one of those organizations where it's a bit more challenging to manage people? And it's not a bad thing. It's so lovely that there's organizations out there that really take
Yeah.
care of the people, but it's also when you have jobs that need to get done, it's a fine line to balance, right?
Yeah. Well, and I've done quite a bit of work in Europe over the years and some of the same constraints in the EU organizations. It's difficult to hire someone, but once they're hired, it's almost impossible to let them go, even if it's a clear performance issue. I do think though, leaders need to learn to hold hard conversations well. In fact, I would say in some respects, if you want to know if somebody's a leader, not just a manager, managers get the easy conversations. Leaders get the hard conversations. And so you and I talk, one of the resources I'll make available to your listeners at the end of our time together is a little ebook on the 3 imperative leadership conversations. First and foremost is holding that hard conversation. How can you and I, with dignity, retaining trust, still look a team member in the eye and have that difficult conversation where the reality of their situation is going to come out. Now, I will also tell you that it is a challenge. I'll never forget a young manager I was working with a number of years ago here in the States who worked for a very large corporation that had some very tricky hiring and dismissal standards. She had a team member who was 3 years away from retirement, and he made it very clear he wasn't going to do any of the things he needed. He was just coasting to retirement. She and I ultimately got to the point where we agreed the best we could do was isolate his influence
Yeah.
from the rest of her growing team. And that was about all she could do. The key was she wasn't afraid to hold the hard conversations.
Yeah, that's such a timely example. I was literally having a conversation with a friend about similar going, what do you do? These especially people
Yeah.
who are so close to retirement, or maybe they've got another job and they're moving in 6 months' time. It's like, they're part of your team. How can you still include them as part of the team, but not let their poisonous influence impact the rest of the team?
Yeah. 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 Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And so we also spoke about character. What does
Yeah.
character mean to you in leadership?
Well, the book, The Leadership Challenge, is in its 13th or 14th edition, and they've been asking the same types of questions for 30 years now. What makes a good leader a good leader? But they're not asking folks like me or you who are passionate about leadership. They're asking line workers, they're asking followers, and pretty much the same short list of character traits: fairness, other oriented, disciplined, organized, some things that enable are you other oriented? Are you That's why I react so negatively to this celebrity leadership misunderstanding we have in the 2020s, because the best leaders are fair. They're other oriented. They're self-sacrificing. They eat last. They make sure their team has what they need to succeed. And um, so putting others first, and I will say, while all 4 of these leadership necessities are necessities, that's why I call them the 4 leadership necessities. I think the one that puts a manager at risk faster than anything else is the character flaw. I was working with a high tech, a technology firm globally a number of years ago. One of the biggest companies in the world. I was doing work in Australia for them. I was doing work in Southeast Asia. I was doing work in Europe. I was doing work here in the States. I was in a workshop where manager's character flaw, personal character flaw, came out in front of about 17 people that reported to he and his management team. And Meef, I will tell you, within about 3 minutes, I saw that man lose the ability to lead. It just was like a wave of disappointment and, even dare I say, disgust and disbelief roll across this conference room where we were all meeting and talking about business excellence, and something that he didn't think they needed to know about, that he thought was his little thing, came out in public, and he lost the ability to lead in that meeting, just like that. Character counts. You'll never be a better leader than you are a person.
That is a really great reminder. Leadership takes time to build, but it can be lost in an instant. And I think that's
Yeah.
something really
Yeah.
important to know. And in terms of
Yeah.
the character traits, I love the focus on other oriented.
Yeah.
And what I've observed with a lot of high performers and leaders in that sense, and this is probably the individual athlete coming out in me when I say this, is I almost see a lot of the time people think if they're other oriented, then it comes at a cost to themselves. And so I see a lot of these leaders burn out. They're burning both ends of the candle. They're never in full health because they go, I need to self-sacrifice in order to be other orientated. What would you say
Yeah.
to that?
Yeah. Well, if we use the biking analogy and the idea of a peloton for a minute, as people rotate through and when they're in the wake of that other bike rider, there's a bit of recovery that takes place. I love slalom water skiing.
Yeah.
And we live about a mile away from a lake. And, I would never be able to do 36 miles an hour out on the lake on my own. I'm being pulled by the boat. And when I sit in the wake and use that wake to my advantage, that makes me able to ski much longer. So I think there is a reward, very practical. I've used a couple of sports analogies for your business listeners. My wife and I own these businesses in Central Texas. We have more than 100 employees that report to us. And of course, we've got a management chain. I have about a dozen managers who report to me. We all, we pay each one of them and they all get paid for their work. My wife and I get paid a tiny little bit on top of each one of what they all get paid that allows us to sustain the businesses and push forward. So there is still a benefit to the leader, but the primary benefit of you making sure other people go first is that team member and the goals that they're trying to accomplish.
I really like the analogy of the peloton and the slalom skiing. It doesn't mean that if you're resting, that progress stops or you stop moving. It's you've done the work up front to get your team momentum, and then they can carry you, for lack of a better term, for a little bit while you rest and recoup and I
Yeah.
guess have that conviction to look up and go, cool, where are we going next?
Yeah. I'm not sure I would have thought of that analogy until I thought of you and thought, she done that for people and she's had people do that for her, right?
That's what I love about this podcast. It's the opportunity to spitball with people who are far more intelligent like me. And so you also mentioned fairness in terms of being a leadership
Yeah.
trait. What does fairness mean to you?
Yeah. So fairness is not equality. And again, I think part of the misunderstanding in our world here in the States, at least, is that everything always has to be equal. I have some people that have greater competence in certain areas. What would be fair for them is to let them grow in that area. I have other people that have better competencies in other areas. The point is that I'm not using them for my own personal game. I'm trying to help them to develop to become the best that they can be.
Mm.
And so fairness, everybody should be able to look at a leader at the end of the day and say, he didn't make it about him. It wasn't all about her. It was really about their team. They weren't just playing favorites. And I think that's key. It's interesting that it's shown up on these short lists of what makes a good manager, a good leader for many years now, that idea of fairness.
Yeah. And I remember hearing an example once where a leader was saying to their team, I'm going to treat you fairly, but I'm not going to treat you equally. Like
Love,
if you're
love it.
performing at different
Yeah.
levels, then I'm going to give the high performers different opportunities,
Yeah.
but I'll treat you all fairly, but not equally. I was like, yeah,
Yeah.
fair point. I respect that.
Yeah. Well, and we all immediately react. I've got a manager I'm working with right now who's being accused of showing favoritism to some of the people that he particularly likes. And we all immediately react to that because we know that's not fair.
Yeah, very true. Very true. And then so
Yeah.
the last four is all around competence. And so what do you
Yeah.
mean by competence?
Yeah. It's interesting because you mentioned earlier, like the top performing salesperson who may not be the best sales manager. And we always kind of default, default to, are you good at the technical thing of what you can do? When you're becoming a leader, it's about getting the team to execute. And in 2024, as we enter into this new year together now, it's a year of risk and uncertainty. And part of what transforms a manager into a high performing leader is being able to make decisions in a risky world. Most of the managers that you and I talk with are making decisions without all the information they wish they had. And, and, and really in some respects, getting wise enough to know when do we need to move and when do we wait? How do we make that decision? And if it was a wrong decision, how do we pivot quickly to try to recapture that? The tension of risk and decision making, I think, becomes in some respects the core competence of an emerging leader. We're never going to get it right, but we can't wring our hands and wait until we have every data point before we tell the team to move forward. We've got to push off with what we know.
And I'm sure there's a skill to that. So recently in my organization, we did the Great Places to Work survey. It's really important to us and it's a
You bet.
fantastic survey. And one of the questions on there is something along the lines of I trust that if I ask management a question, I'll get a straight answer. And people can interpret this a couple of different ways.
Yeah.
My interpretation was if I ask my manager a question, I'll get an answer. Whether to your point, it's right or wrong, I know that I'll be provided with an answer. And I think some people interpret it going, will I get the right answer? And to your point, it's really hard to do business, especially retail business at the moment. And so I'd be interested to hear your perspective on how do you
Yeah.
make decisions when you're actually just hand on heart, not sure if this is the best decision
Yeah.
or if it's going to
Yeah.
work out? How do leaders make
Yeah.
decisions in those environments?
Well, I think one of the things the leaders got to be humble enough to fail fast and fix.
Mm,
And so if we made a decision that wasn't the right decision, let's pivot as quickly as we can. That language around pivoting has become the language of business over the last 3 or 4 years for a reason. We need to be able to fail fast and fix. And that takes us back to the humility that you and I have talked about as well, where the leader doesn't make it about them. There are times, folks, where I don't know what the best answer is, but I know staying here is the wrong answer. So
yeah.
we're going to try this to the best of my ability. Now, here's where, as you gain in experience, the hope is you begin to recognize right decisions versus wrong decisions. But I will maintain in 2024 and beyond, because technology and the pace of business is moving so fast, my last 25 years of experience is less and less relevant in the next 25 months. And I need to be able to fail fast and fix. And I need to have a degree of humility where I'm not so stubborn that I said this is the way it's going to be. And therefore we're sticking with it. Man, if the signs are showing that that was the wrong thing, let's move a different direction and let's do it quickly. The other thing that I've recommended to a number of managers I've worked with is don't be afraid to be a fast follower. There can only be a few true market leaders. It doesn't behoove you anyway. If somebody else has found the right path, get your team on that path. Be a fast follower. And I'll use the water skiing analogy because the best water skiers are fast followers of the boat pulling them down the course. So uh, fail fast and fix, and don't be afraid to be a fast follower, and then learn from your experience.
I love the idea of the fast follower because in the coaching space, so I work with individuals mainly to achieve goals. And typically, unless you're in the business of inventing new stuff, anything that you want to achieve has been achieved before. So one of the exercises we go through is
Right.
is finding a role model, someone who's walked the path and go, cool, how did they do it? What can we learn from them? So I really
Yeah.
like the idea of fast followers, especially in terms of leadership
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. I think that's a great example. There are very few unicorns out there who think thoughts that nobody else has thought. Find the thoughts that work for your organization and move quickly that
Yeah.
direction.
And so we've spoken a lot about what makes a good leader. Why is it important that we have good leaders?
Well, that's kind of the $10 million question, isn't it? For me, I will tell you, you've asked a very personal question. Here in the States, there's a 30-year-old movie called The Blues Brothers. That's a couple of band members going around the country. And at one point in their travels, one of them turns to another and says, when we get to do this, we're on a mission from God because of the passion they were feeling. In some respects, Meef, as I shared 25 minutes ago, my faith journey has really convinced me that when I get to do what I'm called to do to make the world a better place, it's to help managers recognize the high calling of leadership. And does leadership matter? At the end of the day, leadership is the only thing that matters because people won't follow a manager when things get hard, but they'll follow a leader. So you've asked one of the final questions here as a very personal question for me. I think leadership matters more than just about anything else.
That's incredible, and even just hearing you say that out loud, I know talking specifically about managers transitioning to leaders, but I feel like deep down, we're all leaders by leading by example of how we live our lives. And I think one of the most powerful ways
Yeah,
we can lead ourselves and impact others is really living out what we're here to do, our purpose, what I like to call as well. And I think that is
exactly right.
literally our purpose
Exactly right.
on this world, is to find out what we're good at, what our strengths are, what our gifts are,
That's
and
exactly right.
lead through that.
Yep, yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think you and I both believe when each one of us finds that path, the world around us becomes a better place.
100%. And I'd be interested, I'm sure you help leaders with this a lot. We talked about the 4 qualities that make up a great leader. How would you support someone to find their unique version of that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a lot of self-reflection. Part of what I offer my coaching clients is we take a self reflection assessment, the work of leaders assessment that helps them get their hands on it. So, the first job of a leader always is to lead themselves well. So asking themselves a question, am I a good boss? And then doing the 360 work that needs to be done around that, and availing yourself of the resources. I mean, the good thing is there's podcasts like yours, there's books, there's audio books. So there's a bunch of great resources people grab hold of. It really begins by holding up the mirror and asking yourself some hard questions about, am I growing in conviction? Am I growing in competence? Am I growing in character? Am I growing in covenant? You want to know if you're becoming a high performing leader? Start answering those questions.
I love that. And even hearing you speak to that, we spoke at the start by saying, people aren't born out of the womb knowing how to lead, but there is so much information out there now that we might not have been given the tools to us, but there is no freaking excuse not to go find them and develop them for yourself. So if you
That's
are looking to
exactly
be a good leader, there is no excuse not to be able to find the resources. People like yourselves have such
that's
incredible
exactly
free resources as well. So there's definitely the
yeah.
opportunity to do that. And so that leads, I guess, to my final question is what a really actionable step someone can do in the next 24 to 48 hours if they're sitting in that manager category, or if they know they can squeeze more out of themselves as a leader. What would you recommend they do?
Yeah. I think they'd ask themselves those 4 questions probably. How do I grow in conviction, in the ability for me to think bigger, broader, and further? And the second one is, how am I learning to manage risk, even in my current position, and make decisions? Third one would be, why would someone choose to follow me? Am I a person of fairness, other oriented, and how can I grow in that area? And then how do I balance the tension of putting other people first while still striving for excellence? I mean, those questions right there, none of us ever get those fully answered. But if we can wake up every morning and ask ourselves some of those questions, and try to come up with better answers on a day-to-day basis, I think the next 24 to 48 to 72 hours of people listening into you and then trying to wrestle with some of those questions, that would be a great beginning, particularly I think as we're kicking off. Sounds like our podcast is going to be one of the first podcasts of the new year for them. That'd be a great place for them to start the 4 leadership necessities and reflecting on those questions.
I love those questions, and I've been thinking about them out loud for myself, and I think it would make a really powerful regular journaling practice too, because as you've said, we're growing
Yeah,
and leaders need to continue to grow themselves, not only their ability. And so I think
exactly right.
regular check-in with questions like is that, it might sound so silly. And I can already hear people go, I don't need to ask myself questions. I don't need to write them down. And it's like, yeah, you do. You would be listening to this
Yeah,
podcast if you didn't need to do
yeah.
this.
That's exactly right. Absolutely right. Yeah. And then
Awesome.
the other thing you and I talked about, I'd love to make a resource available to your listeners on the importance of leadership communication. So this 8-page ebook, the 3 imperative leadership conversations, it's at the website leadershipmaterials.com. So it's very easy. If they simply go to leadershipmaterials.com, they have an opportunity to give me their contact information, and they'll have the opportunity to receive my periodic blogs and things like that. But it'll give them a worksheet and some best practices around holding a hard conversation, holding a developmental coaching conversation, holding the affirmation conversation. There's ways that you and I can be helping leaders grow, very simple and practical ways moving forward into 2024.
I love it. Thank you so much, Andy, for your time today and for being so generous with sharing those resources and your expertise today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I so appreciate it.
Been my- Yeah, you bet. Been my pleasure. Take care. Enjoy the Australian summer as it gets colder and colder up here.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of the Actually You Can podcast. I so enjoy having you here. and I hope you've taken away powerful insights and tools that will support you to achieve your high-level results. Now, before you go apply all of this wisdom in your life, I would be so grateful if you are able to leave us a podcast review on the platform that you're listening to, or share this episode with a friend. Your support means that we can help more self-led, high-performing individuals just like you expand what's possible for them. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on today's episode, so please go on and shoot me a note on socials and let me know what you think. You can find me on Instagram at MYF'S. Now, go ahead and make those dreams a reality, because actually, you can.